test, and then we actually get into interviews. And there's kind of two categories of interviews. One of them is good, and one of them is not so good. As you can imagine, the good, the valid way, the respected way, the legal way to do interviews is a little bit more difficult and a little more inconvenient than the easy way, which is less valid. So we have structured interviews. Most of us have experienced this and will continue to do so. In a structured interview, everybody gets the same questions, same format, probably in the same room, probably around the same time of day, as much consistency as possible. So the only variance is in the candidate's responses. Because really, when you're going to evaluate a candidate, if it's 9 o'clock in the morning right after coffee and you're pumped and ready to go for the day, you're going to evaluate them differently than if it's 5:30 at night and you're exhausted and you just want to go home. So as much consistency about the context, the order of the questions, who reads the questions, stuff like that, we like that to be as consistent as possible. And that ensures that you're actually just evaluating what the candidates themselves said. Now that's great, but it can feel like you're handcuffed a little bit when you're doing the interview because they say something and you're like, oh man, I really wanted to ask about that thing they said, but that wasn't part of our structure. That's a limitation. And best not to break it, because if you ask this person this extra question, how do you know what the last person would have said? Maybe they had an even better response or a better story or a cool experience that you didn't ask about. So you try to like as much consistency there as possible. There's a few different types of interviews, structured interviews. Most of the time, what we use is a combination of a behavioral interview and a situational interview. A situational interview is like you think about the job that they're going to be doing, and you say, let's think about some common situations that come up on this job, and let's ask them, hey, what would you do in a situation like this? As you can imagine, those questions are not great, because if you ask me, like, what would I do in a situation, I can almost always give you the right answer. That doesn't mean I'm actually going to do it, right? A behavioral interview asks about how you've performed, certain types of tasks or whatever in the past. That's what you did, what the candidate actually did. The reason that a behavioral interview is necessary is because we know that on average, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. It doesn't mean that people can't change. It just means that people usually don't change, right? We can tell what they're going to do by what they've done. So what we do is we combine these. We try to think of situations that are on the job, make them as general as possible, and then transition that to a behavioral interview. So if I'm working on a team, if I'm hiring for a job and the job is working on some kind of a team, right? One of my behavioral interview questions might be, can you tell me about a time when you worked on a team and it went well? Or can you tell me about a time when you worked on a team and it was a dysfunctional team? Because that happens, right? So you see, I'm trying to combine the two. Ask the question that's as closely related to the job as possible, but in a way it's general enough to where pretty much every candidate could respond to it. We combine those, and it allows us to compare everybody kind of equally on those questions. How many questions? I don't know. It depends on the nature of the interview. Usually after about an hour, people are pretty spent. And I found that depending on, like, at least in professional interviews that I do, there are 8 questions maybe, somewhere between 6 and 10 questions. And you'll be able to read the room and tell right away. But if you start with 10 questions to the first interviewer and you're like, man, that took an hour and a half. Well, guess what? All of your interviews are going to be an hour and a half because you can't back off at that point and change the questions. So it's super important to agree on the front end what you will and you won't ask. Unstructured interview, I don't want to talk about it because I don't want you to think it's a good idea. It's not valid. It's not defendable. And if you are being hired at a company and you go through that process and you're there and you have credibility with the leadership team, maybe tell them, hey, you need to tweak your interview procedure. I had HRM 381, so I know how to do it. Yes. Who conducts the interviews? Individual managers, hiring managers, HR people often do the front end to kind of screen out people who aren't going to fit. You do individuals sequentially. So you meet with the hiring manager, then you meet with maybe a team lead, and then if it all goes good from there, maybe you meet with the senior manager, and that's it for the day. Panel interviews of people from different areas in the company. Of course, team interviews, in theory, is the team that you would be working with. All of them can be helpful. Are you going to do all of them as an HR person, as a manager? No, it's insane. It would take way too much work. What you want to do is say, who is the best person to ask the questions, who knows the job well, who can respond to the candidate's questions, right? And how do we balance the need for the candidate to see more and us to get better information from them with our need to actually work on the job versus spending all of our day during the hiring process. Problems in the interview. This, every time I look at this slide, it reminds me, I have a buddy, I will not say his first and last name because I think we still contact from time to time, and I want you to find him. So he's an Arab guy. He lived in Northwest Washington. We were together. We did our MBAs together. Super sharp, awesome guy. Taught me a lot about culture and some of my own bias and stuff like that. So it was really cool. But he said applying for jobs was such a pain in the neck, and if he got an interview going in, was just awful. Like very Arabic name, and he eventually dropped his middle name from his resume. Middle name is Hussein, and it was like right after United States, Iraq, invasion stuff, and he's just like, man, brother can't get a break anywhere. So finally he gets and looks, and he goes in for the interview, and he felt like, man, when I walk in, it's not hi, nice to meet you. It's, oh, hey, there's a Muslim guy, and it was extremely frustrating. So that's what you call like a snap judgment or a bias stereotype. And immediately in his head, the interviewer is thinking, is he going to fit here because he's whatever he's from Sudan, because he's from Sudan, because he's Muslim. He's not. They're not thinking, is he going to fit here for his knowledge, skills, and abilities, right? That actually fit the job. So there's all kinds of problems. Halo effect we get if I'm interviewing someone and they say, hey, I love to go elk hunting and my favorite football player is Cam Chancellor, then I would say, excellent, you are hired for the job. Matter of fact, you're my new boss, because clearly they're great. So a halo effect is related to kind of similar to me bias. It means one positive thing outweighed everything else. The opposite of that, of course, is Horn's effect, where one negative thing kind of outweighs everything else. Cultural noise, obviously, is a multicultural environment, certainly in the United States, but in many ways globally. And that is when you come in, all I hear is your accent, or all I see is your burqa, or all I see is something that's reflective of culture, and I can't get beyond that in my head. So we like to train managers in this. Does that mean they have an hour training, they're good to go? No, of course not. That's why you usually have an HR person involved throughout the entire procedure, if of course you actually have one. Background investigations, can we do them? Yes, we can. Should we do them? Absolutely, depending on the job. So if you're hiring someone to work in a nursery or a child care center, yes, you better freaking do the background checks. If you're hiring someone who's going to be a delivery driver, yeah, you might want to know how many DUIs they've had. Like these things matter. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it. How I do it, if companies call me and they want a background check, is a firm I use in California, and I say, here's the information. The candidate signs a consent, says, yes, I know you're gonna check my background, and they go to state jurisdictions, federal databases, everything, and send me everything they have on the person that's related to that job. We don't just get everything on the person's life. You go, okay, for this job, these are the things that are most related. I'm hiring an accountant. I want to know what their credit score is. If they can't handle their money, they can't handle my money. Stuff like that. So job specific as much as possible. Drug tests, you want to list these on the application. So if someone fills out the application, they know that they're snorting cocaine on the weekends, and they see there's going to be a drug test here, then they can just pass, and you don't waste your time and money going through that process. Two big reasons that we do background investigations. Number one, negligent hiring. You guys remember the civil rights laws in 1964 I talked about? It's really scary because it carries what's called punitive damages, meaning punishment. If you discriminate, you're not just going to get sued for back pay and reinstatement. You're going to get sued, and there'll be punishment involved, sometimes into the millions of dollars. Not always, not often actually, but sometimes. So negligent hiring is basically when you hired someone that you shouldn't have. You knew, or in most cases, should have known not to hire that person, and you did. The person with 3 DUIs, UPS hires them, and they're drunk driving a UPS truck and they kill a family. That's coming back on UPS, A, morally, ethically, and that HR person and manager is going to have to sleep at night knowing that a family is dead because of their employee. And B, it's coming back on UPS in terms of a lawsuit because they knew or should have known this driver had a history of DUIs. So that's negligent hiring. It's one of the reasons we do background checks, especially in jobs that carry risk. Negligent retention, this is when you didn't fire somebody that you should have fired. So here's an example. Someone's doing meth on the weekends, they drive a forklift, they come to work, they hurt somebody. You send them home, we do an investigation, it was an accident, you bring them back to work, and you never drug test them. On their first day back, they run over somebody at the forklift and kill them. That's negligent retention. You knew or should have known. You should have drug tested. You should have checked criminal background. You knew or should have known the person shouldn't be working there. Two things that freak us out, both in terms of protection of our employees and their families, but also in terms, of course, of lawsuits coming back at us. That's why we want to select well and do our homework on background investigations, including reference calls. Sign release, we got the, yeah, we said both of those. Excellent. Yes, we said both of those too. Hey, glad I was on it today. Okay. Medical examinations and inquiries, just put it on the application. One of the first things the employee should know if they're filling out an application or submitting their resume is that any offer of employment will be conditional on a fill in the blank. What is it? It's conditional on a drug test, conditional on a evaluation of some kind, whatever it is. If you test somebody for illegal drugs, and I use the word illegal in quotes because we do live in Washington here, some mix-ups between Washington and Washington, D.C. But if you test someone for illegal drugs and they test positive and they go, no, I promise it was poppy seed muffins, it was the medication I'm on, it was, you know, whatever, we can let them test again. The policy that I recommend, there's no hard and fast rule. If someone fails a drug test and we have a zero tolerance policy, okay, I'll go, okay, I'll pay for one more. If they were my top candidate, I'll pay for one more. If they fail that one, I'll be like, no, it's on you. Now I'm going to need to see 3 drug tests once a month over the next 3 months that are all clean before I'd consider hiring you. Failed twice. Your analysis are about 95% accurate. Are there some ways to have drugs in your system and pass those tests? Of course there are. Are there ways to test out those ways? Of course there are. So when you go to a lab, it costs you about an extra $5. You just say, for these urinalysis, I want to pay the extra money for an adulterants or a dilution test. And that sniffs out about, I don't know, 90% or more of the ways that people get around it. This is a fun area. We might do some work on this later in the quarter because in Washington, it's recreational cannabis is legal. So someone's like, I was smoking weed on Saturday, no big deal, showed up for work on Monday, and my business, usually if there's any kind of safety issues, they'll have a zero tolerance drug policy, and it'll be enforced in random drug tests, and I would argue as they should because people's lives and well-being are at stake. And someone says, hey, I was smoking weed on Saturday and I went in on Monday and there was an accident, so they drug tested everyone that was around the accident, and so they fired me. That's legal. I wasn't on work time. I was home. It's legal in Washington State, etc., etc. I feel it's a legislative challenge. I mean, I feel for that person. Like, yeah, I get it. You're kind of operating within the bounds of the law, but from an organizational risk assessment perspective, and I'm pretty conservative about risk to the company, especially when it involves, I got 4 little kids, right? It involves families getting hurt, getting affected that way. And if someone says there's no way that the smoking weed on Saturday affected me having an accident on the forklift on Monday, my response back to them is, I don't give a crap. There was THC in your body, in your system, and your assessment on whether it did or didn't affect you is irrelevant because that family knows you have a zero tolerance drug policy. That person had THC in their system and there was an accident. They don't care if you were high or not. The guy that's laying in the hospital doesn't care if you were high or not. It was there. So because of that, you've put the company at risk. So it really is, I mean, it's an ethical challenge. It's a legal challenge. Hopefully they'll get it worked out someday, whatever it's going to be. But I do get the question a lot. In Washington State, can an employer fire you if you test positive for THC, which is right, the active ingredient in marijuana? And the answer, of course, is yes. They can do that. What if I have a green card? What if it's for medical? It still doesn't matter. There's certain accommodations you might make. I'm imagining, I'm guessing here, I don't know. if someone asked me this question as a consultant, hey, we have a university in Central Washington, and there's a psychology professor. We have a zero tolerance policy. The psychology professor who has glaucoma, and they smoke marijuana or use some kind of tincture, whatever, THC, to deal with that pain. I would, in my head, I'd be like, that's a reasonable accommodation, right? If we can ensure things like driving to work, are they in walking distance, other safety stuff. But for in the classroom, in my head anyway, that's probably fine. If someone is a pilot and they say, I have a green card, medical use of marijuana, I don't give a crap. You're flying a plane 30,000 feet in the air at 500 miles an hour. I don't care how many medical cards you have. There's too much at stake there. So we balance risk with right to privacy often. And we don't always make friends when we do that, because we're balancing the safety and the well-being of our employees with the financial and reputation security of the firm, with that individual's just freedom and a right to their own privacy. So stuff of fun. It makes the job awesome. You get to do all kinds of stuff. All right, so you finally found the person. Okay, you did your personality tests, and you got your selection predictors, and you went through your interviews, and you got down to that one person, and they passed the drug test. You got great references, and the background checks were all clean. Sweet, you ready to make your move as a company. Don't do things over email and text, because you want to make sure there's clarity in communication. Matter of fact, side note, the rest of your life, if it's important, don't do it over text or email. You can thank me for that later, maybe. When you make the job offer, give it over the telephone. That's usually best, because when you call them in face to face, it can even be some awkward pressure, but phone is what's normal. A formalized letter outlining whatever you said in the telephone call is then sent to the applicant. Usually it's a PDF scanned. You send them over email. You can do a hard copy if you want, but you don't have to. Your offer document. So what the candidate sees when you say, hey, we want to offer this per hour, or your annual salary, and see benefits package attached, and this many days off, and under this offer is contingent under these conditions, etc. You want it to be reviewed by some kind of legal counsel or somebody who knows what they're talking about, and that's to avoid creating a written contract. Like, we're going to give you this. You have all kinds of fine print in there. It's like the iPhone's user agreement, right? This isn't a guarantee of employment. It's employment at will and contingent on these tests and probationary periods and all that stuff in there, so you don't end up creating a contract and you shoot yourself in the foot. Okay, last slide. Make the job offer. What you want back from them is a signed acceptance letter for that offer, and then you file it. You got it. And as soon as they start work, 72 hours, document they are who they say they are, and work authorization in the United States. Then begin onboarding. All the required trainings, which we'll get to, safety trainings, which we'll get to, job orientation, which we'll get to. Everything begins. This is when the fun begins at that point. So that's chapter 7. That'll do it.